Welcome to A Fresh Face in Hell. I'm your host, Jonathan Emerson. Every week we talk to someone new and interesting, somebody intellectually curious, somebody who will hopefully renew our faith in this cold, cruel world we live in. A Fresh Face in Hell. So today in our maiden voyage of A Fresh Face in Hell with Jonathan Evison, we're going to talk about book banning, which is a subject that's very close to me, having written one of the most banned and challenged books in America, Lawn Boy, not to be confused with the Gary Paulsen middle grade book of the same title. That's an important distinction. So as somebody who grew up in punk bands in the early 80s as a 13, 14-year-old, I've always seen rattling cages as a part of the artist's responsibility. When I wrote Lawn Boy, I was hoping to rattle some cages, but those cages were not about pedophilia or sexual content. It was about the perils of late capitalism, racial and financial inequities, and basically just the sham American dream. But when it was banned for sexual content, which we'll get into, I got to say that was like pure street cred as far as I'm concerned, and just pure dumb luck. Before we begin a broader conversation with today's guest, I thought I'd walk you through my personal experience with book banning because it's a pretty interesting story, and it may inform this conversation. It started one morning in September of 2021. I woke up just like any other morning, poured a cup of coffee, and went right to my email and socials. And when I checked, I think I checked my Facebook messages first, and I had a whole bunch of message requests. I mean, like a bunch of them. Usually there'd be one or two a day or something, but there was a bunch of them stacked up. And so I go, I start reading them, and immediately it's a bunch of death threats or just generally menacing emails from people named TJ and JT. Everybody, one of them was like, if you ever set foot in Texas, I'm going to kill you. And there was messages that said, who are you, you sick fuck? What do you do to your girls behind the bushes? And I'm like, whoa, what's going on here? Jeez. So I did some Googling, and it didn't take long to find out that there was a video of a woman named Brandy Berkman, who's a Republican woman in Leander, Texas, which is a suburb, I believe, about 30 miles north of Austin. Well, Brandy Berkman's son apparently had come home with a copy of Lawn Boy, and she had, vetted it and found, among other things, there was 174 fucks by page 47, which, I don't know if she counted right because that number sounds a little low to me, actually. So what she did is she marched into this school board meeting, and essentially she just filibustered the whole meeting, just took over and was demanding accountability from the librarians and, school administrators. What is this book doing in my son's library? And meanwhile, her poor kid is standing there. I don't know, maybe he's 14 years old, and he's holding a sign. It's like a paper plate with Sharpie on it. And it says pedophile, misspelled, And she's saying, who writes books about adults having sex with children? I'll tell you who, a pedophile. So basically she called me a pedophile, and this video went viral on TikTok, and that's why I was getting all these threats, which is amazing because that's really all it took. Nobody read the book. Clearly Brandy Berkman didn't read the book, let alone these other people that didn't have time. They just saw this video and decided I was a pedophile and decided to start threatening me and my family. But let's get something straight. Lawn Boy is an adult novel, not a YA novel. It was never my intention to have the book placed in a middle school library or, high school, sure, but not middle school libraries. That's because it was conflated with the Gary Paulsen middle grade novel. The book did find a crossover audience with young readers when it won the American Library Association's Alex Award, which distinguishes an adult novel with special interest for young readers. But there is no pedophilia in Lawn Boy. The scene in question, which involves a couple of 20-somethings awkwardly discussing a preteen sexual encounter they'd had decades before. Well, Brandy Berkman either has remedial reading comprehension, or more likely she was willfully misrepresenting the book because she said it was, like a 30-year-old realtor being, filleted by a 10-year-old. That's not what was happening. Any reading of the book, it's obvious that's not what's happening. Anyway, I had to shut my socials down for a couple weeks until things cooled down because the threats came in. And after that, as a result, Lawn Boy has gone into like 5 additional print runs. All it's done is sold books. So despite these massive bannings, it was the second most banned book in America that year. I think it dropped down to number 7 last year, but it's still up there. If I'm being honest, the book banning it's been overwhelmingly positive experience for, whatever, my pocketbook or my sales track or whatever, aside from that first negativity. But before we go further with today's guest, I want to point out it has gotten me involved as a free speech advocate, working with like the ACLU and Penn Center and other organizations, which is awesome. It feels good to be doing something proactive. But the real heroes in all of this are the educators and the teachers who are on the front lines, the people who've not only been threatened and harassed like me, but they've lost their jobs defending the right to read. And it's because of these people and the sacrifice they've made that I've become so active with these organizations. So, I've been kind of put up on some kind of pedestal for writing a banned book. Like, that's so cool. Yeah, that is great. But there's people losing their jobs, and these are the librarians and educators. So, as promised, today we're going to talk to somebody who's an expert on book banning. Her name is Kasey Meehan. She's a Freedom to Read program director at Penn America in New York City, an initiative to protect the rights of students to freely access literature in schools. Previously, Kasey served as the Associate Director of Post-Secondary Policy at Research for Action, which is a mission-driven education research organization in Philadelphia. Kasey's going to share with us some of the details of a recent and quite comprehensive national study on book banning, which yields some pretty shocking results. So please welcome to the show, Kasey Meehan. Thanks for coming, Kasey.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for having me.
Yeah, so Penn did the study, right?
Penn America, yeah. So we release, biannual, like semi-annual reports on book bans, as well as lots of other public commentary that's always ongoing. So yes, we have studied the book bans.
Okay, and you just released a new study.
We did, just in this past, in fall 2024, depending on when your listeners are chiming in, we released a new study that looked at the entire 2023 to 2024 school year. So officially, like, it's last year's school year data, but it's our most recent report.
So can you walk me through it? I mean, what is the MO for this study? What are you trying to? I mean, I read through the study, I saw the demographics and I saw the numbers, but my listeners have not. We did put a link in your bio, so maybe some of them have, but walk me through the sort of the breadth of the study.
Yeah, so Penn America has been tracking instances of book bans that are happening in our public schools since 2021. So this is our third annual report, and what we saw in this report is, once again, this movement has just continued to expand, accelerate. We named our largest number of instances of book bans to date, counting over 10,000 instances of book bans during the 2023 to 2024 school year, which is nearly triple than the prior school year, the 2022 to 2023 school year. So, the movement to ban books continues to accelerate. We see more and more types of books being swept up in these efforts to censor certain identities, stories, histories from our public school classrooms and public school libraries.
Yeah, it did. Seems like, in looking at the list of titles, the first thing, of course, I noticed is that I've dropped out of the top titles, but I think that's because I already got banned everywhere, so they need fresh wood to burn. But it's too bad because I liked being in the top 10 there. I noticed that genderqueer. It seems like they're spreading out. There's more and more titles, and I think first can we talk about the difference between a ban and a challenge? How does Penn define that? And you know what I mean? Because sometimes I noticed in my personal experience, the book would be challenged first, and then sometimes it would be put back on the shelf, and then it wasn't a ban.
Yeah. So Penn America, we consider a ban anytime a book is removed from access, even if that access is temporary. So for us, like in your case, actually, we may have considered that a book ban if it was removed while it was undergoing review. So we look at sort of three types of bans. We call it kind of like the banned, like it's permanently banned. It's not coming back. There was a final decision made on the access of the book being removed. We also track bans pending investigation. So these are books that are removed while they go through a reconsideration process. We include that type because reconsideration reviews can take days, weeks, months. We've seen in some places when districts are, overwhelmed by lists that are 100 book titles long, that review process could take, over a year. So as long as that book is no longer available or access to that book is restricted during that review process, we consider that a ban because that book has been removed from access, even temporarily. And then we also include books that have been banned with restrictions. So this could be a book that was available, let's say in a middle school, went through a review, and now is restricted with parental permissions, or moved from a middle school library to a high school library only, where middle schoolers no longer have access to that book. So again, for us, our guiding principle is always access. And once access to a book is removed or restricted, we count that as a book ban. Um,
And there's a lot of guerrilla warfare that goes on too. I mean, stuff you can't even track. I mean, I know that there's angry moms out there, these, Republican mama bears that go in there and they'll take it on themselves to remove books, and who knows how long it's going to take. I mean, for
there's so
anybody
much
to
that
figure
we
that.
don't count. Yes, absolutely. I mean, we're able to count what we're able to count, and in the last school year, it was a ton of instances of book bans and unique titles that have been removed. But we always say this is an undercount. So much of the book banning crisis is not publicly reported. So decisions are being made that don't end up on a school district website or aren't locally reported by a journalist. So that, without that data, we don't include that. We do know, like, classroom libraries have been closed, entire school libraries have been closed. I mean, it's certainly, our sense is that it's much, much larger than even our alarming figures are able to point to.
Yeah, and I mentioned this a little bit in my monologue. I'm sitting in a very comfortable position for all this because all it does is sell books and get me press, which, I mean, as a guy who grew up in punk bands, that's like, cred, right? But like, I mean, I've talked to librarians that have lost their jobs and teachers that have been threatened. I went to the Idaho legislation in Boise, and it was they were trying to push through this legislation, and they were doing it. It was like 7 in the morning on the first day of spring break kind of thing, because and they were trying to get through some legislation that said that consumers could sue a bookstore or a library because they were offended by the content. And I'm like, wow. I mean, what do you think the end game is here? Are these people really just Puritans, or is this kind of in a way, it kind of feels like a political straw man sometimes?
I do think there's a ton of fear mongering that has gone into this movement. So I do, I kind of take, I do kind of align with your perspective here on a political straw man. I mean, we see, um, just like the fear mongering and rhetoric that shows up in the language, that books are pornographic, or books are obscene or sexually explicit.
Pedophilic in my
There
case,
you
even
go.
though,
Right.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah. So, like, the language that's been used has really intended to raise fear and alarm over, but, like, the reality is, like, these books are so far from those definitions. The authors are so far from the terrible labels that are imposed upon them. Librarians and educators, do not, do like, their aim is to support students. Like, I guess I won't speak for every librarian everywhere always, but, like, the majority of librarians are good faith actors here, that are aimed, their aim is to get good books into the hands of students to help them read and advance their literacy and gain empathy skills. So, there is a lot of fear mongering that has happened, that has really led to this. But what we've seen, if that has been kind of like the local, more grassrootsy approach, then we have seen this taken on by legislators. And I think, we always point to legislation as like supercharging this movement. So we do see legislation in Idaho, we see it in Iowa and Florida and in Utah and Tennessee, where now there are these prohibitions on certain types of books that are affecting, how librarians are considering books that they're buying for schools, whether schools are pulling books off their shelves altogether. There's some legislation that even threatens to criminalize librarians if anything that they are distributing or providing is deemed as, offensive or pornographic or obscene. So there's some real threatening language that's now finding its way into enacted legislation, and that, really supercharges everything we've been watching for the last, 2, 3 years.
so in 2021, I think when you guys did your first study, when the whole September that year when this all started, uh, I had read that there was that probably super Republican super PAC funded Mothers for Liberty or Moms for Liberty group that were actually responsible for, like, sorry, I'm not a great numbers guy, but it was something like 93% of all the challenges. and this is a group of like 8 or 12 women, and I'm wondering, how is that even legal? Like, I mean, shouldn't you have to be a part of that, have a child in that school district, or at least live in that community to be able to? How can these? Can you help me understand how this operates? How these women? I don't know where they're based. Texas, probably Florida, Texas, or Iowa, if I had to guess. What do? They just sit and fill out paperwork for?
Yeah, I mean, I think we see this happening a few ways, but we often point to like, right, the two drivers behind the book ban movement or legislation, and then these local individuals and groups that are putting a lot of pressure on their particular districts. So yeah, for individual, I mean, I think it was Hannah Nathanson of the Washington Post did something that identified that 11, kind of like agitators were behind, something like 80-90% of all book bans nationwide. Um, and that I mean, that's accurate. We know there are individuals who are submitting, lists of hundreds of books that are getting pulled from their district. Often, they don't always have a student in the school. I think where we see, some
Well,
progress
they can't
being made.
possibly if there's 11 of them and they're launching thousands and thousands of book bans across the country.
Right. Like it's a pretty core, like you see the tactics being shared. I mean, they share on Facebook. There's, meetings where full lists. Like that's the other thing. I mean, I know you can speak to this too, is like you're all of a sudden, your work is now being targeted, not just in one district, but all of a sudden, like, showing up on challenge lists in districts across the country, and that's part of this, like, coordinated network of, like, here's a list of books that we wanna see removed, and then, send out kind of, like, groups and individuals to put pressure on a given district to remove those books. But there is a coordination happening for sure.
That's where they're good. They're really good organizers. They're really good at insinuating themselves on every level of governance. And I think they seem to realize that. Most of their people in the trenches are just waiting for their orders, right? So
And I
I
think
think it's
people do respond to, like, fear. I think we've seen that quite a bit, like, I have, there's a partner that we work with closely in Texas who, like, she will use the phrase that, like, fear is effective, and I think that's right. Like, you see it come all the way down from, your influential kind of, like, state elected leaders who can hold up a book and say, "There's porn in your schools," to, really kind of, like, well-coordinated group of individuals as part of Moms for Liberty that are kind of repeating the same thing. And then what happens is like it seeps down, and then people do, in fact, they kind of like show up in response to that message when in reality there has never been porn in public schools, or certainly not like as brought in by, their school librarians and educators. Um,
Yeah, like they'll show up once they have, once they have the fear and the rage. But these, where are they at the regular PTO meeting? Or like, I got all my kids go to co-op schools, and I'm like, where are they then? You know what I mean? It's like suddenly they have some sort of vested interest with what's going on in the classroom. But other than that, they're not paying any attention.
Mm, yeah, I mean, PEN America, we also did a recent analysis of Project 2025, which is it was a document, a playbook kind of released from the Heritage Foundation that um, was identified as like the conservative kind of playbook for a new administration. And you begin to see kind of the parallels there. And one of the things that we called out in our analysis of that document is that, yeah, I mean, from kindergarten, from like kinder through like higher ed, there's an attempt to impose some like greater ideological control on our public institutions. And I think that's what we see. Book bans is one of several tactics within that larger umbrella of if we remove books that feature LGBTQ plus people, if we remove books that talk about the United States history with slavery, if we remove books that feature individuals of color, and the varied, life experiences, real or fiction of individuals of color, then like it removes certain narratives, removes certain stories from like our collective understanding. And if we're only kind of exposed to certain types of content, certain types of identities, certain types of, histories, that there is kind of this, you begin to see how they're shaping, or how there's restrictions around like what we are all accessing and understanding collectively. Um, and kind of like the imposing again of this like narrow ideological idea for what society, looks like. So we do see that showing up, which I understand can sound like a little meta, but
Well, I mean, it sounds like Mao's China to me. I mean, the ultimate, I mean, how far do you take that? At first, it's, you start taking text out of it, and then, well, the next logical step is replacing it with an
yeah.
alternate.
Right, exactly. I mean, we see all the time. There's in addition to book bans, I mean, we have followed what we call like educational gag orders. So that's it's prohibitions on discussing certain topics in K-12 and higher ed. We see, the way that diversity, equity, and inclusion offices or programs have been removed from our public, schools and public universities. So, there's many kind of like layers to it. I think Penn is able to somewhat uniquely, point to book bans as like a example of how the removal of information, can have larger impacts on our collective kind of like understanding and our empathy, with each other and with those who have different experiences with us. And, when you begin to restrict access to information, to the right to read, to the right to learn, to the right to write, I mean, those are authoritarian tactics for sure. And that's how, we see this as real threats, not just to one's individual or an author's, access to writing and reading, but a larger kind of threat towards our democracy and, what we think of as, public schools and public libraries and public colleges as being very much so part of the unification process of a very pluralistic, increasingly pluralistic and diverse, society. So when we start chipping away at these like public institutions, what is the harm is,
And
could
pluralism,
be
like,
quite big.
let's be honest, pluralism is like the one great American ideal that hasn't been a complete failure as far as I'm concerned. I mean, America has failed to make good on all of its promises except for this idea of pluralism, which is beautiful to me. This idea that we absorb cultures from all over, but what I see happening is that globalism then sort of flattens that. So all this wonderful racial and cultural diversity we saw in the mid 20th century, say, you know, I now don't go down to like South Lake Union in Seattle, and it's never been more racially diverse or more, gender fluid or anything. But at the same time, it's like the culture is flatter than it's ever been. Like it's just Amazon tech culture. You know what I mean? It's not like all these cultures are. So pluralism is kind of under attack by globalism as well as conservatism. And I mean, that saddens me because I mean, I just look at every city in America now feels like Orlando, you know what I mean? It just it loses its when we talk about globalism, sorry, I'm spinning off on globalism. My producer's probably wringing his hand. Here he goes on another globalist rant. Anyway, okay, I'll get off it. Um
But no, I mean, I think a lot of too, like, for us, it's no coincidence that 2021 really kicked off the movement to ban books because, that happened kind of on the heels of George Floyd's murder and lots of other, racialized reckoning again that was happening across the country. And schools responded. My sense is many schools responded by like looking at their curricula, looking at their school library collections, and saying, "Huh, like." Maybe these aren't very culturally representative, or we have lots of students in our districts. Like, how can we, bring in materials that look and, mirror all of our students and families and communities? And then, in that kind of progress towards, pluralism, towards better representation of such a diverse, student body that many of our school districts serve, we see this pushback against, like, hold on. We're not ready for that. Some of these topics, identities, histories, yada yada, are making some people
Yeah, and what
uncomfortable.
interestingly, and people don't talk about this that much, but there's a little bit of a sense that at times free speech is under attack from the left as well, because like this idea of whitewashing history, the idea of going back and because there's hard R's in Mark Twain, or like I was revisiting Booth Tarkington's novel 17, which is just kind of a comic picaresque about a teenager, and it was hilarious. But I was just struck at the racism. Like I was just like, oh, the characterization of the black character. I'm just like, but that needs to be there because like and my son, my 15-year-old, when he was about 13, he got really into what's his name? The Cthulhu the guy that created all the demons and monsters, 19th century writer, huge. I always forget his name, but he was reading it. He's like, his imagination was really into him. But he's like, this guy's a total racist. I mean, I think that it's important that we recognize that. I don't think, so when people on the left talk about, like, let's clean that up because we don't want any, how do you feel about that? I mean, you're just about free speech no matter what, right?
Yeah, like, PEN America is pretty principled on this one, and I think, generally our tagline is that, books aren't harmful, censorship is. I mean, I think there are, I think there's lots we could, digest that a bit. I would say the current movement we're seeing in is really pushes from the right, but, you're not wrong in that there have been, calls to, censor, suppress, or, stop, um restrict access to certain books from the left as well. To me, sometimes I do also look at like where the calls are coming from. Some of what we've seen again since 2020 is, potentially students like petitioning their school board to have more, updated contemporary books that talk about race and racism versus, kind of holding on to some books that have more outdated, or have outdated racialized tropes, and stereotypes. So, sometimes it's like who's
Yeah,
calling
and,
for
motives clearly. I mean,
changes
I don't
to
think the motives we're
access.
talking about people
Yeah.
trying to I think I think their motives aren't, I think they need to just rethink it. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, but I mean, you're right though, like Penn has, we're pretty principled on that. Again, we would never call for a book to be removed based on the content of that book, whether those pressures are coming from either side of the political spectrum. And even the way, you speak to your son's experience, I mean, I do think there's learnings, like, added contextualization can be really helpful when reading a Huck Finn so that, you understand time, place, situation from author and how we can learn from those texts, which is ultimately, the point
well,
of books for
Voltaire
us to.
said, "I do not believe in what you say, but I'll die for your right to offend it." So what happens when, you know, how do we frame hate speech? Do you know what I mean? Like, we'd all like for it to go away, but just on a purely principle of free, like the right to gather and so forth, how do we address this? Because I mean, that's a slippery slope if we're just talking about, like the Voltaire quote.
Yeah, I mean, again, so Penn America as a free expression organization, we sort of we match hate speech to the First Amendment in the United States, and certainly it's permissible, unless kind of inciting of violence and harm, right? But that like line can be quite blurry around like where does hate speech, suggest or provoke, some sort of harm and violence against an individual. So I think there's lots of I do think you have to navigate that quite closely. And I am certainly not the expert on this. I feel like I stick to my lane on book access and freedom to read. But yeah, I mean we have, but for example, like Moms for Liberty again is one of the um one of the groups that we see, driving a book ban agenda, and we have, commented on how their efforts to ban books is a restriction of freedom to read, and at the same time, we've also defended, their gathering. So they have been, they've held conferences at museums and different places that we have said, they do in fact have the right to assemble. So it's, sort of within that space, we try and be quite principled around, uh, from kind of from the points that we ourselves or I myself as a advocate in the space for making sure students have access to books. Like I personally, have a hard time and disagree, but the principle of kind of accessing the right to assemble, the right to speech. I mean, those are principles we uphold.
My kid did his recent book report on the anarchist cookbook. And, if you're familiar with it, there's like, at the end, there's like recipes from all time. But like his interest was political. He had read Das Kapital the year before. I mean, he had a political interest in it. I know he was being a little irreverent or contrary, but I mean, I got a note from the school. They're like, we just want to let you know. And I'm like, no, this is something I should have done at the top of the interview, but I'm still learning. Um, we need to talk about exactly what Penn Center does, because you're such a broad. I mean, we know the Penn, we know that all the awards, the Penn Hemingway, the Penn. We know that you give out awards. We know that you do this free speech advocacy. But can you give us an idea? This is a huge organization. Can you give us an idea of the larger umbrella that you work under?
Yeah. Yeah. So PEN America is, 100-year-old nonprofit. Our mission is to sit at the intersection of human rights and literature and defending free expression in the United States and worldwide. So we have different ways that we do that. I mean, certainly there's a big piece of our work, and this speaks to the awards, where we celebrate free expression. So celebrating authors and writers and journalists and, comedians and all sorts, using their pens for the power of change and the word. And that's part of a big piece of this, is like celebrating that literary excellence and the access to free expression. um, and then we also, on the other side of the house, we defend free expression. So this looks like, some of our international work, where we are providing support to writers at risk. These could be writers who've been jailed or, threatened by more authoritarian regimes abroad, providing kind of awareness of their case and supports where we can. And then, domestically, so much of this work has really expanded over the last, 4 years. I mean, I think we've always had of an eye towards, what free expression in the United States means, but the need to defend it has only gotten more urgent over the last few years, I would say. So our US free expression programs look at everything from, book bans to campus protests and campus free speech, professors and what they can and cannot, speak to in the classroom, things like that, of supporting public universities and delivering, education for all, opposing these like censorial pieces of legislation, or these educational gag orders that restrict what can be delivered and discussed in classrooms from K-12 through higher ed. So that's a lot of our US, providing digital safety and support against online abuse, and protecting journalists, combating mis and disinformation. I mean, that's a lot of what we do, within the US free expression programs.
Is there a legal arm to the Penn Center? I mean, do you guys have a legal team yourselves, or do you work with?
Yeah, we have, like, at this point now, there's 3 individuals on our team, but we do also work with outside counsel quite a bit. But we have a legal director and a staff attorney, and then some other, individuals that were previously, had litigated in their prior roles and continue to support our litigation work. So one of the examples is Penn currently has a lawsuit against a school district in Florida, actually, over the book bans. So that work is ongoing, and we've also been able to provide amicus briefs and provide other kind of legal efforts where we can.
Wow. Well, thank you for being out there. And I mean, this is a lot. I mean, this is a huge. What is it with Florida and Iowa? And I mean, I know those are two of the big "don't say gay" states, right? Can we talk about the "don't say gay" and how there's sort of been sort of a subtle spin-off of that movement?
Yeah. I mean, we see certainly, and we actually we opened an office in Florida, because so much of what we see happening nationwide, I mean, unfortunately, like, it does incubate a bit in Florida, and that's true for legislation as well. So, what happened in Iowa was almost like they took provisions of some of the Florida legislation and, brought it to Iowa. We also see that, um, happening in like within Tennessee legislation, or there's regulations in South Carolina that we're tracking, where you begin to see how the language of a given state, begins to appear in some peer states. So that's certainly, when we look at our most recent book ban report, Florida and Iowa are leading the way as having the highest number of books banned, in states.
And
And
the lowest number of readers as well, probably. I mean,
I we don't do that analysis, but yeah, somebody else should. But yeah, in Iowa, that comes directly from recently passed legislation, and then Florida, it's a mix of, like, they have legislation, and then they also have these, like, very active kind of individuals and groups that we've talked about already. And those when those forces kind of converge on a given school district or within a state, I mean, that's really where we see the number of book bans sort of escalate. But, there are other states, and given the year, it kinda shifts. Like, Utah has been top of the list before. And Utah state law now has a no read list where if three districts in the entire state, so there's like hundreds of districts in the state of Utah, but if just three districts decide that they want to remove a book because of that book being deemed as, inappropriate, then that book jumps up to a no read list for every school district across the state of Utah. So that book is essentially, banned across the state.
At
And we
which
see
point it just sells like gangbusters. Like people run out and they will find access to it. These young readers will go out and find that. And I feel like they got to see that. And I also feel like while we're talking about numbers, we have to talk about the most striking number of all of this, which kind of, it's kind of the premise of much of this is that the percentage of what is it? What are the percentages again of how many books are feature protagonists of color or non-binary gender orientations and so forth?
Yeah, it changes year to year, and we haven't yet completed our cumulative, like, 2021 through 2024. But when we look at the most recent school year, this 2023 to 2024 school year, the trends are, fairly consistent that, of books actually, we were only able to analyze, I should say. So, of our most recent data that we've analyzed, we were only able to look at the 1,000-ish most commonly banned titles. So, there's about 4,000 unique titles that were banned over the last school year. So, this is just looking at, like, the most commonly banned titles, but we see that 44% of those, include characters of color, and then 39% of those books include LGBTQ plus people, or characters or themes. And again, that's been kind of like consistent year to year. This year, we also point that 57% of the books include sex or sex-related content, and that's something that, I think if year one was kind of an attack on critical race, I'm putting this in quotes. I know we're on a podcast, but critical race theory showing up in, books in public schools, and year two became more of a, attack on discussion, the representations of, sexuality, sexual orientation, gender identity. Year three, we do see kind of ramped up efforts around prohibitions on books that have any sex and any sexual relevant or related content in the books, which can be, widely interpreted. So we do see, those three kind of target areas pretty much consistent from year to year. But as like language and kind of the rhetoric in the movement changes, we also see some jumps where this year we see, a significant amount of the books that were pulled are books that have sex. And of course, these can all be overlapping too. So it could be, a book that meets all three, classifications.
Well, you got to ask yourself, what are they going to find in these books that they're not going to find in a Judd Apatow film? And, there's going to be gratuitous sex, there's going to be gratuitous language, but the thing you're not going to see so often is, again, non-binary action, or you know what I mean, things that are not this sort of white Judeo-Christian cisgender status quo, because clearly anywhere on the internet, anywhere on TV, like they got to know. Again, this just becomes very political. I mean, because they really don't logically have a argument to stand on, because it's ubiquitous. Your kid can get on his phone on the internet and or she, and they can find any of this stuff.
We see sometimes like on our top list, we always I don't know. I don't know what part is more shocking than other parts of this, but I mean, so many of the books, there's also, again, language that these are like adult books that have made their way into public schools. And there are adult books that students, because smart kids want to read up, or any kid wants to read up and access books at different age
I was
levels. But
reading Dickens and Kurt Vonnegut when I was 9, and my
exactly,
11-year-old's reading way beyond. Yeah,
for sure.
I mean, and
But still, like, most of these books that we're talking about that are being removed are young adult books, and they tend to be more contemporary. They do tend to be, more, they are more representative, and, oftentimes too, the most popular ones are on Netflix. Like, I think about this all the time, like Heartstopper, Red, White, and Royal Blue. These are two, like, very popular series and films on, Netflix, the same way that The Hate U Give by Angie Thomas was, top of the charts streaming movie as well, like, while it's being, banned and suppressed in schools. So, yes, I mean, I certainly I do think there's some, like, irony in that, kids are just gonna watch it on Netflix, and why take away the format of reading, which in some ways offers, even more than a format of viewing.
Well, I think to answer that question, I think the answer is, you know, critical reasoning. You know what I mean? Nothing about we're not gonna learn critical reasoning watching a Netflix show that we're gonna learn by, that sort of narrative thinking and connecting ideas logically. That comes from reading. It does seem like I used to hear it a few years back. I heard it suggested by conservatives that this is an issue, book banning was an issue that much like the, right has weaponized "They're coming for our guns" and gun control, the right saying that the left is weaponizing book banning. Like, this really isn't as big of a phenomenon, and they're just working the media and everybody up into this big thing, and, like, I don't know, maybe 3 years ago, you might get, like, a half a second attraction with that idea, but now we're looking down the barrel at, at Project 2025. You know what I mean? And are you familiar with what provisions or whatever's in 2025 that speaks directly to education
Ye
and
Yeah, I mean, so, again, Penn's analysis of that Project 2025 pointed out a few things. I mean, certainly this idea of, like, what is obscene. I mean, we see this in the book banning movement now that, what's being labeled as obscenity meets no colloquial or legal definition of obscenity. But our sense is that, based on kind of the Project 2025 playbook, that they would like to see a broadening of that definition, that legal definition of obscenity, to include potentially LGBTQ plus characters, or to include sexual assault, which again are things that, sexual assault is something that is not harmful to read about and actually can help be quite preventative, and um, helping young people avoid and, navigate those situations. So anyway, but we do see that this idea of, like, broadening a legal definition around obscenity to include, more kind of identities and stories that we already see being removed from book bans. We do see language around, again, criminalizing librarians for, distributing any sort of material. So that in itself, not it's threatening, like, that would be horrific, if librarians are criminalized, and then but just the threat of it, creates a chilled atmosphere over our public schools, and certainly over educators and librarians around how they navigate this in their own roles. So certainly, I think we see the removal of potential removal of the Department of Education, which within the Department of Education is the Office of Civil Rights. Office of Civil Rights does a lot of work around supporting and making sure that students and educators and families have their civil rights, met and upheld in public schools, and are the first to, kind of like a front line of challenging when students, say that I'm being discriminated against, or, my rights are not being recognized in these ways, that office can provide some legal support in getting, districts to adjust and to support, all their students within a given school district. So, I think those are some of the top line kind of concerns that we see out of a
it's
potential.
consistent with the Republican playbook in general, which is just deregulate everything because, big government. We don't need anybody to tell us it's all about our personal freedom. And yet they would limit everybody else's personal freedom.
Else's I mean, we see that in the parental rights, that parental rights language. That's kind of like our first talking point, is like, for whom? Like, one individual or a couple individuals are having such an outsized influence in restricting access for students and families, like, across a given
Exactly, well,
district.
across
So,
the country, again, back to
agreed.
Mothers of Liberty. I mean, if we're talking about, 10 women, they're having a huge effect. There's this loud minority, just like Brandy Berkman herself. And what scares me is, like, for me personally, that blowback was immediate from people. Obviously, she didn't read the book, clearly, right? I mean, she willfully
X taken out of
yeah,
context,
well, and
excerpt,
willfully
yeah.
misrepresented it, and that's all it took was a TikTok movie, and I got death threats. I got, I got creepy pedophiles saying, "Yeah, what I wonder what you do to your kids in the bushes," and you know what I mean? Like, I'm just that's
It's
all it
awful.
took. Like, that's what scares me is like, okay, you have there's layers to this, right? You have your people trying to legislate and organize, and they have some critical thinking and organizational skills, but the people that they're mobilizing, the boots they're getting on the street, the people that are going to storm these school board meetings like an angry mob, they will not inform themselves. They don't have time. They won't, they're not going to read these books. They're not going to, I mean, for instance, like, you know, Gary Paulson, who also wrote a book called Lawn Boy, right? Middle grade book about a kid who mows lawns for money. That poor guy, he died right in the thick of this in the
Uh,
fall of 21. And I know he was getting death threats just like me because that was the whole problem. They were conflating a book
right.
because they're so dumb. Oh, there might be two books called Lawn Boy. Nobody thought to check. You know what I mean? Instead, they try to crucify the librarian you know what I mean? It was obviously a filing mistake or something like that, but that's what scares me. There's a real mob mentality to this, and it's dangerous. And I think the people that are, you know, blowing that dog whistle know that.
I mean, yeah, I think so too. I mean, I think they have to. I also there's been so much, in addition to kind of reports from Pen America, the anecdotal data here from authors, from librarians, from educators. I mean, I do think about this all the time. Like, a librarian who's been a 20-year-old librarian, all of a sudden, like 20 years at a given district, let's say, all of a sudden is getting, called some horrific names from people in the community. It's like, why would our first thing not be to defend that librarian who's been like, working and supporting students in a district for so long? Like, to hear kind of, those stories are quite emotionally taxing and professionally, draining, and even professionally ending in some cases. So it is, yeah, it's really, that part is, the emotional toll of this all is quite alarming too.
Yeah, no, I've spoken personally to teachers who have left their positions because they were living in fear, and I know. I mean, luckily, most of mine came through the email and stuff like that. But I mean, like, it's unnerving to be, and the more uneducated or uninformed the person threatening to use, the more sort of menacing it is because like, there's really no logic behind this. These people, I think it might have been Penn. I forgot what organization I worked with in sort of creating a best practices for authors and educators who were under attack. You know what I mean? Like, so the first thing I did, disengage, right? Just do not, the last thing you want to do is answer this because they just need that fresh wood to burn. That's exactly what they want. There's this weird passive aggressivity to it where it's like they gaslight you and then they want you. And then the more you answer back. So that was one of the main things we talked about is just not to engage. But now, as a culture, we're forced to figure out how do we engage. They figured out what their playbook is. They got the whistleblower. Well, we want you to crash the school board meeting and be irate and say get these books off the shelves. And pretty soon it's like torches or something. It's like it's scary. What do we do on the other side of that? How do we mobilize our people? We've been really good with mobilizing Penn Center and ACLU. I mean, we have these great organizations like you guys working on this, but what do we do boots on the ground?
Yeah. I mean, I do think too, I agree that the team driving for book bans has been quite coordinated pretty early in this. Um, but more and more, like, where we see book bans, we see this response that you're talking about, and this could be, parents that have organized to say, like, "Hold on, this doesn't represent this singular voice does not represent all of us." Student groups are usually, front and center, which is a lot to ask of them, but, students are always there, defending, their own right to access information. Educators, librarians, supported by these like national organizations like Penn, and you mentioned ACLU, the American Library Association, National Coalition Against Censorship, some of the teachers unions. I mean, that's certainly, I think, we just need to be as loud and as coordinated in our defense of books and our defense of the right to read. And, I think it's hard to do like a tick for tack kind of argument when, some of what, as you mentioned, like sometimes it's like, it's so illogical. So, I think for us, it's always like grounded in books are amazing. Books are important. Students need access to books. Students should be able to see themselves in books. Students should be able to learn about others through books. Books are safe, and that books aren't harmful. Censorship is, but the more I think we can coordinate and show up on that message, the stronger it will be. And that could be everything from showing up at your local school board meeting, your public library, hearings. Authors have played such an incredible voice in this movement to, talk about like why did they write their book in the first place? Like, we hear all the time from authors that they wrote the book that wasn't available to them when they were growing up, and how, how many letters they get from young people about like this book was so saving to me, or was, so helpful for me, or X, Y, and Z. I'm sure I can
That was
imagine you have
exactly my
thousands of these
experience with
letters.
I
Yeah.
got lots about Mike. I mean, that's Mike's complaint is, "Where are the books about me?" You know what I mean? Because like myself, he was an autodidact, and I just remember as a kid, it's like, "What? Where's the books about people, working class people with, dirt under their fingernails, and, I wanna read about that." Um, One thing I do find interesting, we're getting close to running out of time, but I I do think that it's good that we're having this debate nationally. It's frightening. I do feel I mean, we all feel threatened, but it brings books to the forefront in an era that otherwise, listen, I see my royalty statements and I'm a New York Times bestseller. It's not as much as you'd think, I mean, people don't read nearly as much, and yet books continue to occupy this huge spot in our culture in terms of cultural currency. Like, way more people, the music industry or the film industry is way bigger. If you look at the numbers, and you don't do 15 million your first weekend, you're shot as a feature film. A book sells 4,000 in a first week, and it might crack the New York Times bestseller list. So I think it's great that why do you suppose that is? It's because why do you suppose that books continue to occupy, and Amazon is another example, right? Like, it could be wholesale plumbing supply, it could be shoes, it could be any one of these things could be at the forefront of that monopoly argument or the loss leader argument of trying to push the competition out of base. But it always seems to be books, and the written word still seems dangerous. And this is heartening to me, but why do you suppose that is?
I know, I feel like you're better able to answer that as an author, but as a reader, I mean, I think about this, books have just, books are, people who love books, like, really love books. I feel like I'm a lifelong reader. My family, when we go on vacation, we still do, like, sustained silent reading as a group. Like, everybody goes into their corners and reads, and then we come back, after that. But, I think books are transformative. I mean, we hear this from authors all the time that you're able to write to, like, a new kind of, like, write in a way that, like, evolves us all, right? That's sometimes those are the books that always, like, strike me, the ones that, like, present a world a little bit differently than the world that we're currently living in, or make us or challenge some of our, like, normative thoughts, or introduce, people's lived experiences that I don't share, and help me, cross that
There
and
you go.
empathize with those
Empathy, right.
individuals. So,
Yeah.
I feel like, yeah, it's just is the books are forever transformative, and I do think in that spirit, they can make people a little shaky, but come on. I feel like that's the power of reading. And there's a reason too that reading, writing, arithmetic are like, when we talk about schools, it's always shocking to me that we're going to restrict, reading,
Hey,
because
I'm
I'm
all for
like,
banning arithmetic. Get me on board. I'll switch sides for
yeah,
that one, man. My kids come home. I'm having to learn the new math. I mean,
it's
I can't even. My
complicated.
my sixth grader bringing home math, and I'm like, I don't help me out here.
Yeah, but there's been a
Um,
lot of
uh,
discourse around just, like, kids reading, and I'm like, "Well, maybe if we stopped, putting all these restrictions on, and having more libraries and more access to books, kids will read again, because
and maybe
reading is
this
cool."
is, to wind up here is maybe this is what the end game is that reading offers a window into empathy, and in an authoritarian
Mhm.
society, we want as little as empathy as possible. We want, and also this critical thinking. You're not going to learn critical thinking watching movies the way you are with something as collaborative as a book. That empathy, that getting inside the story and walking a mile in somebody else's shoes. I think that's dangerous to people who are threatened by empathy.
I think you're right. And I think those are our, like, that to me is our call to defend more so than ever. Like those, two reasons. Like we want the next generation of young people to think critically and empathize. We want them to be able to read. We want to see our books, increasingly representative of our society and being able to introduce us to new worlds and places. So let's defend them.
Well, Kasey, thanks so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure, and really, really thank you for all the work you're doing at Penn Center, and thanks for having this conversation for me. As I said, I think it's an important conversation, and we got to fight for books because I think we kind of got to it today a little bit. Like this is why they're so important. We lose books, we lose empathy, and we lose a large degree of our critical thinking, and those are dangerous ideas to people who want to ban books. She is Kasey Meehan from the Penn
There you
Center in
go.
New York. She is a good egg. Uh, can people reach out to you and thank you? Can they
For
give
sure.
money to the Penn Center? How can they help the
Always.
cause?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
always accepting donations at the Penn Center. Um,
You can find us at like pen.org/action. That's usually where most of our book ban, reporting and kind of ongoing call to actions live.
well, again, thank you so much, Kasey.
Thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate it. And it really, I mean, your voice here is so important too.
Well,
So thank you
always
for having
call
this
on me for
conversation.
one of the great things about this is I become kind of a free speech activist, because I kind of got drawn in this and I never say no to any of
Hmm.
it.
Awesome.
A Fresh Face in Hell with Jonathan Evison is brought to you by Fresh Face Pods and produced by Jason Botkin and yours truly. Check us out on Instagram, YouTube, or at our website at freshfacepods.tv. Don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter for updates and special content. And if you love the podcast, by all means, run out and buy all of Jonathan Evison's award-winning novels wherever books are sold.